The dust on Amaryllis Harper's black dress was a reminder that even grief could not excuse sin, at least not in the eyes of Pastor Whitcomb. She stood at the back of the small wooden church in Gonzales, Texas, watching the other congregants file forward to receive communion on that sweltering Sunday morning in June of 1878, her throat tight with unshed tears and her heart heavy with shame she did not deserve. "I am sorry, Miss Harper," Pastor Whitcomb had whispered to her before the service began, his thin lips pressed into a disapproving line. "But until you repent of your father's debts and the circumstances of his death, I cannot in good conscience allow you to partake in the Lord's Supper. The rumors about the gambling, the drinking, the company he kept in his final days, they reflect poorly on you as well." Amaryllis had wanted to scream that she had done nothing wrong, that her father's mistakes were not hers to carry, that she had begged him to stop drinking and gambling away what little money they had. But she had learned long ago that women's voices carried little weight in places like this, especially women who were alone in the world with no male relative to speak for them. So she had nodded silently and taken her seat in the back pew, feeling the eyes of the congregation on her back like brands. Now, as the last of the parishioners returned to their seats, she slipped out the door into the blazing Texas sun. At 22 years old, she had buried both her parents within the span of 3 years, lost the small house they had rented when the landlord demanded the back payments her father had neglected, and now found herself working as a seamstress in a cramped room above the general store, taking in mending and alterations for barely enough money to buy bread and beans. And apparently, she was not even worthy of taking communion in the church where she had been baptized as a child. The tears came then, hot and bitter, streaming down her cheeks as she walked away from the church toward the edge of town. She did not know where she was going, only that she needed to be away from the pitying looks and whispered judgments. Her feet carried her past the last of the buildings and onto a narrow trail that led toward the hills beyond Gonzales, where the land grew wilder and the mesquite trees clustered thick along the creek beds. She walked for nearly an hour, her grief and anger propelling her forward until she reached a clearing beside a spring-fed pool of clear water. There, she finally stopped, sinking down onto a sun-warmed rock and burying her face in her hands. The sobs came from deep in her chest, violent and cleansing, and she let herself cry until she had no more tears left to shed. "You are a long way from town for a lady in a Sunday dress." The voice startled her so badly that she nearly fell off the rock. She looked up to find a man standing at the edge of the clearing, and her first instinct was fear. He was enormous, well over 6 feet tall with shoulders that seemed almost too broad to be real, and arms corded with muscle that showed beneath the rolled-up sleeves of his homespun shirt. His hair was dark brown and hung past his shoulders, tied back loosely with a strip of leather, and his face was weathered and strong-featured, with a thick beard that could not quite hide the scar that ran along his jawline. He carried an axe over one shoulder and had a coil of rope hanging from his belt, but his eyes, a striking pale blue against his tanned skin, were kind, concerned even, and his voice, though deep and rough, held no threat in it. "I did not mean to frighten you," he said, lowering the axe to the ground slowly. "I live up in those hills. I came down to check my traps and heard someone crying. Are you hurt?" Amaryllis wiped at her face with the back of her hand, suddenly aware of how she must look with her eyes red and swollen and her hair coming loose from its pins. "No," she managed, her voice hoarse. "No, I am fine. I am sorry. I did not know anyone lived out here." "Most folks do not," the man said. He took a few steps closer but kept a respectful distance, as though he understood that his size might be intimidating to a woman alone. My name is Yates Owens. I have a cabin about a mile up the ridge. Been living there near about 5 years now. Amaryllis Harper, she said automatically, then wondered if she should have given a false name. But something about the way he looked at her, with straightforward honesty and no hint of the judgment she had grown so accustomed to, made her feel oddly safe. "That is a pretty name," Yates said. "Are you certain you are all right, Miss Harper? It is a hard walk back to town if you are not feeling well and the sun is fierce today." "I am well enough," Amaryllis said, though in truth she felt hollow and exhausted. "I just needed to get away for a while." Yates studied her for a long moment, and she had the sense that he saw far more than she wanted him to. "Man trouble?" he asked finally. Despite everything, Amaryllis felt a bitter laugh escape her throat. "Pastor trouble," she said, "though I suppose in a way it is the same thing." Something flickered across Yates's face, an expression that might have been understanding or anger or both. "Whitcomb," he said, and it was not a question. Amaryllis looked up at him in surprise. "You know him?" "I know of him," Yates said. "He came up to my cabin once, about 3 years back, to tell me I was living in sin and needed to come down to his church to receive salvation. I told him I had all the salvation I needed in these hills, and he was welcome to leave my property before I helped him along." Despite her sadness, Amaryllis felt the corners of her mouth twitch. "I imagine he did not take that well. He told the whole town I was a godless heathen," Yates said with a shrug of his massive shoulders, "which suited me fine. I do not need his version of God, and I do not need his church. I have my own way of praying." Amaryllis felt something stir in her chest, a flicker of curiosity that momentarily pushed aside her misery. "What do you mean?" Yates gestured around them at the clearing, the trees, the spring. "This is my church," he said simply. "The mountains and the sky and the land. I figure if God is anywhere, he is here just as much as in some building with 4 walls and a pulpit." The words resonated with something deep inside Amaryllis, something she had never quite been able to articulate. She had always felt closest to peace when she was outside, when she was walking in the early morning or watching the stars at night. The church building itself had never brought her the comfort. It seemed to bring others. "Pastor Whitcomb would say you are going to hell for thinking that way," she said quietly. "Maybe," Yates said. "But I reckon hell cannot be much worse than some of the things I have already seen. And if God is as judgmental as Whitcomb makes him out to be, then I am not sure I want anything to do with that version of heaven anyway." Amaryllis found herself standing up, drawn toward this strange, powerful man who spoke such heresy so calmly. "What did you see?" she asked. Yates's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he would not answer. Then he sighed and looked away toward the hills. "I was a soldier," he said. "Fought in the war, saw things no man should see. When it was over, I could not go back to cities and crowds and people. So I came out here, built my cabin, and learned to live alone. It is a better life than I had before. Do you ever get lonely?" The question slipped out before Amaryllis could stop it, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I am sorry. That is too personal a question." But Yates just looked at her with those startling blue eyes and said, "Yes, sometimes I do." They stood there in the clearing for a long moment, the sun filtering through the mesquite leaves and the sound of the spring trickling over stones, and Amaryllis felt something shift between them, some unspoken understanding that she could not quite name. "I should get back to town," she said finally, though she did not want to. The thought of returning to her lonely room above the general store, of facing the whispers and sideways glances tomorrow at the market, made her feel sick. "Will you tell me what happened?" Yates asked. "With Whitcomb, I mean. You do not have to, but sometimes it helps to say things out loud." So Amaryllis told him. She told him about her father's death, about the debts and the drinking and the way Pastor Whitcomb had decided that she was somehow tainted by association. She told him about being refused communion, about the shame and anger and grief all tangled up together until she could barely breathe. Yates listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "That is not right," he said finally, and there was a fierce edge to his voice. "That is not what faith is supposed to be. Faith is supposed to be about mercy and compassion, not judgment and shame." "You sound like you know something about it," Amaryllis said. "My mother was a believer," Yates said. "A real one, not like Whitcomb. She taught me that God loves everyone, no matter what mistakes they have made or what circumstances they find themselves in. She died when I was 15, but I never forgot what she taught me." He paused, then added, "If she were alive to hear what Whitcomb did to you, she would have marched into that church and given him a piece of her mind." Amaryllis felt tears prick her eyes again, but this time they were not tears of shame or anger. They were tears of gratitude because this stranger, this mountain man who barely knew her, was offering her the compassion and understanding that her own pastor had withheld. "Thank you," she whispered. Yates nodded. "Come on," he said. "Let me walk you back to town. It will be dark in a few hours, and this trail is not easy in the twilight." They walked back together slowly, and as they went, they talked. Yates told her about his life in the mountains, about hunting and trapping, and the simple routines that filled his days. Amaryllis told him about her work as a seamstress, about the small satisfactions of creating something beautiful from scraps of fabric, about her dreams of someday having her own shop. By the time they reached the outskirts of Gonzales, the sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Yates stopped at the edge of town, clearly reluctant to go further. "I do not come into town much," he explained. "Too many people, too much noise. But if you ever need anything, Miss Harper, my cabin is always open to you. Just follow the trail to the spring, then head up the ridge to the north. You cannot miss it." "Thank you, Mr. Owens," Amaryllis said. "I appreciate your kindness more than you know." "Yates," he said. "Just Yates." "And you are welcome, Amaryllis." The sound of her name on his lips sent a strange warmth through her chest, and she found herself smiling for the first time all day. "Goodbye, Yates." "Goodbye," he said, and then he turned and walked back toward the hills, his long strides carrying him quickly out of sight. Amaryllis made her way back to her room above the general store, her mind full of thoughts of the mountain man with the kind eyes and the scarred face. That night, she lay in bed and replayed their conversation over and over, finding comfort in the memory of his words and his presence. The next morning, she woke with a sense of purpose she had not felt in months. She went about her work with renewed energy, taking in 3 new alterations and finishing a dress she had been working on for the mayor's wife. But all day long, she found her thoughts drifting back to Yates and the clearing by the spring. It was 3 days before she worked up the courage to go back. She told herself she just wanted to see the spring again, to sit by the water and think. But deep down, she knew she was hoping to see Yates. He was there when she arrived, stripped to the waist and chopping wood near the edge of the clearing. The sight of him made her breath catch in her throat. His body was a marvel of strength, every muscle clearly defined as he swung the axe with effortless power, the blade biting deep into the logs with each stroke. Sweat gleamed on his skin in the afternoon sun, and his hair hung loose around his shoulders. He looked up when he heard her approach, and a slow smile spread across his face. "Amaryllis," he said, setting down the axe, "I was hoping you would come back." "You were?" she asked, suddenly shy. "Yes," he said simply. He grabbed his shirt from where it hung on a tree branch and pulled it on, though he did not bother to button it. "Would you like to see my cabin? It is not much, but I am proud of it." Amaryllis nodded, and Yates led her up a narrow trail that climbed steeply through the trees. True to his word, the cabin was not hard to find. It sat in a small clearing at the top of the ridge, a sturdy structure built of logs and chinked with mud and moss. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and there was a small vegetable garden beside the door. "You built this yourself?" Amaryllis asked in amazement. "Every bit of it," Yates said with evident pride. "Took me the better part of a year, but it is mine. No landlord, no rent, no one to tell me what I can and cannot do." He showed her inside, and Amaryllis was surprised by how clean and orderly everything was. There was a large stone fireplace with cooking implements hanging beside it, a sturdy table and chairs, a bed covered with thick furs, and shelves lined with books and supplies. In one corner, she saw something that made her stop and stare. It was a carving, a beautiful piece worked from a single piece of dark wood. It depicted a mountain lion in mid-leap, every detail of the animal's body rendered with incredible skill. The power and grace of the creature seemed almost alive. "Did you make that?" she asked. Yates nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. "I carve sometimes when my hands need something to do. It helps me think." "It is beautiful," Amaryllis said honestly. "You have real talent." "My father was a woodworker," Yates said. "Before the war, anyway. He taught me some things when I was young. I just sort of picked it back up after I came out here." Amaryllis wandered around the cabin, taking in all the small details that spoke of Yates's life here. There were herbs hanging from the rafters, drying in bunches, a rifle mounted on the wall above the door, a stack of furs waiting to be tanned, books on history and philosophy and natural science. It was the home of a man who had chosen solitude but had not abandoned learning or beauty. "I envy you," she said quietly. "This place, this life, it seems so peaceful." "It can be," Yates said. "But it is hard work too, and lonely, like I said before." He moved to the fireplace and began to build up the fire, then set a pot of water to boil. "Would you like some coffee? It is not fancy, but it is hot." "That would be lovely," Amaryllis said. They sat at the table and drank the strong, bitter coffee, and talked about everything and nothing. Yates asked about her work, and she found herself telling him about the satisfaction of creating something with her hands, of taking disparate pieces and turning them into something whole and beautiful. He listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he truly cared about her answers. In turn, he told her about the mountains, about the animals he saw and the changing of the seasons, about the storms that rolled through, and the stars that shone so bright at night that it seemed you could reach up and touch them. His voice was low and rough but soothing, and Amaryllis found herself relaxing in a way she had not relaxed in years. It was late afternoon when she finally rose to leave, reluctant but knowing she needed to get back before dark. Yates walked her down to the clearing by the spring, and as they stood there saying goodbye, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. "I want you to have this," he said, holding out his hand. In his palm was a small wooden carving of a flower. And Amaryllis, she realized with a start. He had carved it from pale wood, and every petal and leaf was perfect, delicate despite the strength of the hands that had made it. "I have been working on it since you were here last," Yates said, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "I wanted you to have something to remember that you are beautiful and worthy, no matter what anyone else says." Amaryllis felt tears sting her eyes as she took the carving from him, cradling it gently in her hands. "Yates, this is the most thoughtful gift anyone has ever given me. Thank you." "You are welcome," he said, and the warmth in his eyes made her heart flutter in her chest. She went back to town that evening with the wooden flower tucked safely in her pocket, her heart lighter than it had been in months. Over the next few weeks, she found herself making the journey to Yates's cabin again and again, sometimes bringing him supplies from town as an excuse, sometimes simply showing up to sit and talk. Each visit, she learned more about the complex, thoughtful man who had chosen to live apart from society. He was well-read and intelligent, able to discuss philosophy and politics with as much ease as he discussed hunting and trapping. He was kind to animals, gentle with the injured rabbit he found and nursed back to health, patient with the young deer that wandered into his clearing looking for food. And he was unfailingly respectful toward her, never pressing for more than she was willing to give, never making her feel uncomfortable or afraid. But beneath his gentleness, she could sense a deep well of strength and controlled power. She saw it in the way he moved, with the fluid grace of a predator, in the way his hands could snap a branch as thick as her wrist without apparent effort, in the way his eyes went hard and cold when she mentioned the continued slights she endured from Pastor Whitcomb and some of the more self-righteous members of the congregation. It was on her fifth visit that things began to change between them. She had brought him some fresh bread and butter from the general store, and he had invited her to stay for supper. He cooked venison steaks over the fire, seasoning them with herbs from his garden, and served them with roasted potatoes and wild greens. It was simple food, but it was the best meal Amaryllis had eaten in months. After they ate, they sat outside on the bench he had built beside the cabin door, watching the sun set over the hills. The sky was ablaze with color, and the air was finally beginning to cool after another scorching day. "I look forward to your visits," Yates said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "These past few weeks, knowing you would come, it has made everything feel different, better." Amaryllis's heart began to beat faster. "I look forward to them too," she admitted. "When I am here with you, I feel more like myself than I have felt in years, like I can breathe properly." Yates turned to look at her, and in the fading light his eyes seemed to burn with some inner fire. "Amaryllis," he said, and her name on his lips was like a prayer. "I know I have no right to say this. I am just a mountain man living alone with nothing to offer you but a rough cabin and a hard life. But I need you to know that you have become important to me, more important than I thought anyone could be again." "Yates," she whispered, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "I am not asking for anything," he continued quickly. "I just wanted you to know, you are the first person in years who has made me want to be around people again, who has made me remember that there can be goodness and kindness in the world, not just pain and ugliness." Amaryllis reached out and took his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his much larger ones. His hand was calloused and scarred from years of hard work, but his touch was gentle. "You have become important to me too," she said. "I think about you constantly. When I am working or lying in bed at night, I find myself thinking about what you might be doing, whether you are safe and well. I have never felt this way about anyone before." Yates let out a long, shaky breath. "I am not good with words," he said. "I never have been. But I want you to know that if you ever needed anything, if you ever needed a place to go or someone to protect you, I would be here. Always." "I know," Amaryllis said, and she did. She knew it with a certainty that went bone deep. This man, this fierce, gentle giant of a man, would keep her safe no matter what. They sat there holding hands as the stars began to emerge overhead, neither of them speaking, both of them feeling the weight of what had just been acknowledged between them. When Yates finally walked her back to town that night, he kept her hand in his the entire way, and when they parted at the edge of Gonzales, he lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles with a tenderness that made her knees weak. "Good night, Amaryllis," he said. "Good night, Yates," she replied, and she walked back to her room feeling as though she were floating. The next Sunday she attended church again, though she dreaded it. She had been going every week, despite Pastor Whitcomb's refusal to allow her communion, partly because she felt she should and partly because she was afraid of what people would say if she stopped. But now, after spending so much time with Yates and hearing his thoughts on faith and God, the whole thing seemed hollow and false. Pastor Whitcomb's sermon that morning was about the importance of maintaining moral standards within the community, about how a few rotten apples could spoil the entire barrel. Amaryllis sat in her usual pew at the back, feeling the weight of his words like stones. When communion time came, she did not even bother to stand. She simply sat there, watching the others go forward, feeling more alienated than ever. After the service, as she was leaving, Pastor Whitcomb stopped her at the door. "Miss Harper," he said, his voice dripping with false concern, "I have noticed you have been spending time away from town lately. I hope you are not falling into bad company." Amaryllis felt anger flash through her, hot and bright. "I am spending time in nature, Pastor," she said, keeping her voice level with effort. "Surely there is nothing sinful about that." "Nature can be dangerous for a woman alone," Whitcomb said. "And I have heard rumors that you have been seen with that mountain man, Owens. That is precisely the sort of company I was referring to. The man is a godless heathen, Miss Harper. Association with him will only further damage your already questionable reputation." Something inside Amaryllis snapped. Perhaps it was weeks of pent-up anger and frustration. Perhaps it was the memory of Yates's kindness, and the way he had treated her with more respect and compassion than this so-called man of God ever had. Perhaps it was simply that she had finally had enough. "Yates Owens is a better man than you will ever be, Pastor," she said, her voice ringing clear in the morning air. Several people nearby turned to stare, but she did not care. "He has shown me more Christian charity in a few hours than you have shown in my entire life. He does not judge me for my father's mistakes. He does not make me feel small and worthless. He treats me like a human being with dignity and respect. If he is a godless heathen, then perhaps your God is not worth worshiping." Pastor Whitcomb's face turned purple with rage. "How dare you?" he sputtered. "You are clearly beyond redemption, Miss Harper. I want you to know that you are no longer welcome in this church. Do not return until you have repented of your sinful ways and your association with that man." "That will not be a problem," Amaryllis said coldly, "because I have no intention of ever setting foot in this building again." She turned on her heel and walked away, her head held high, ignoring the gasps and whispers that followed her. Her hands were shaking and her heart was pounding, but she also felt lighter than she had in months. She had finally stood up for herself, and it felt wonderful. She went straight to her room, changed out of her Sunday dress into a simple cotton work dress and sturdy boots, and set off for the mountains. She did not care that it was the middle of the day or that she had not told anyone where she was going. She needed to see Yates, needed to tell him what had happened. She found him at the spring, washing a bundle of furs. He looked up when he heard her approach, and his face broke into a smile that faded quickly when he saw her expression. "What happened?" he asked, standing up immediately and coming to her side. "Are you hurt?" "I told Pastor Whitcomb exactly what I thought of him," Amaryllis said, and then, to her surprise, she started to laugh. It was a wild, slightly hysterical sound, but it felt good. "I told him you were a better man than he would ever be, and that if you were a godless heathen, his God was not worth worshiping. And then he told me I was no longer welcome in his church." Yates stared at her for a moment, and then, incredibly, he started to laugh too. It was a deep, rumbling sound that came from his chest, and it was the first time she had ever heard him laugh so freely. "You did not," he said. "I did," Amaryllis confirmed. And suddenly they were both laughing, standing there by the spring in the warm sunlight, laughing until tears ran down their faces. When they finally calmed down, Yates pulled her into his arms, holding her close against his broad chest. She could hear his heart beating strong and steady beneath her ear, could feel the solid warmth of his body, and she felt safer than she had felt in years. "I am proud of you," he said quietly. "That took courage." "I do not know what is going to happen now," Amaryllis admitted. "People in town already looked at me sideways. Now they will probably treat me like a pariah." "Then do not go back," Yates said simply. She pulled back to look up at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean do not go back to town," Yates said. "Stay here with me." Amaryllis's breath caught in her throat. "Yates, I cannot just move into your cabin. People would talk, and besides, I have my work." "Then marry me," Yates said, and though his voice was calm, she could see the intensity in his eyes. "I know it is fast. I know I should court you properly and give you time to decide. But Amaryllis, I am 30 years old, and I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. I think I fell in love with you the first moment I saw you sitting by that spring, crying your heart out. Marry me and let me spend the rest of my life making you happy." Amaryllis felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "You love me," she whispered. "Yes," Yates said simply. "I love you. I love your strength and your kindness and your courage. I love the way you laugh and the way you look at the world with wonder despite everything you have been through. I love the way you make me feel like maybe I am not broken after all, like maybe there is still good in me worth saving. And I know I am not much, just a rough man living in the mountains, but I swear to you that I will spend every day of my life trying to be worthy of you." Tears were streaming down Amaryllis's face, but they were happy tears this time. "You are already worthy," she said. "You are the best man I have ever known. And yes, Yates, I will marry you. I love you too. I think I have loved you since that first day as well." Yates let out a whoop of joy and picked her up, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. When he set her down, he cupped her face in his big hands and kissed her, gentle at first and then with growing passion. It was Amaryllis's first real kiss, and it was everything she had ever imagined and more. His lips were warm and firm, and the scratch of his beard against her skin sent shivers down her spine. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. "When?" Yates asked. "When can we get married?" "As soon as possible," Amaryllis said. "But Yates, Pastor Whitcomb will not marry us now, and he is the only minister in Gonzales." Yates's expression hardened. "Then we will find someone else. There is a circuit preacher who comes through the county every few months. He is a good man, nothing like Whitcomb. We will wait for him if we have to." "What if he does not come for a while?" Amaryllis asked. "Then we will wait," Yates said firmly. "I want to do this right. I want you to be my wife in every way, legal and binding. But in the meantime, we can start building our life together. There is plenty of room in the cabin, and I can build a dividing wall for propriety if that would make you more comfortable. You can bring your sewing here, and we will figure everything else out as we go." Amaryllis thought about her tiny room above the general store, about the loneliness and the judgment and the constant struggle to make ends meet. And then she thought about waking up every morning in the mountains, about spending her days with Yates, about building a life with this extraordinary man who loved her. "I do not need a dividing wall," she said quietly. "I trust you." "And I trust you," Yates said. "But we will wait until we are married for everything else. I want to honor you properly." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Amaryllis went back to town one last time to collect her few belongings, and to inform the owner of the general store that she would be leaving. The news spread through Gonzales like wildfire, and by the time she left, half the town knew that the Harper girl was running off to live in the mountains with the godless heathen. She did not care. Let them talk. Let them judge. She was going to be with the man she loved, and that was all that mattered. Yates met her at the edge of town with his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Buck, and loaded her trunk onto the animal's back. Then he lifted Amaryllis up onto the saddle in front of him, and they rode off toward the mountains together, leaving Gonzales and its narrow-minded inhabitants behind. Life in the mountains was different from anything Amaryllis had ever known. The work was hard, to be sure. There was water to haul from the spring, wood to chop, a garden to tend, meals to cook over an open fire. But there was also a freedom and a peace she had never experienced before. She woke each morning to the sound of birdsong and the sight of Yates's face, relaxed in sleep in the early dawn light. She spent her days sewing or helping with the chores, or simply exploring the beautiful wild land around the cabin. And she spent her evenings sitting with Yates by the fire, talking and laughing and falling more deeply in love with him every day. True to his word, Yates was a perfect gentleman. He had given her the bed while he slept on a pallet near the fireplace, and though the longing between them was palpable, he never pressed her for more than she was ready to give. They held hands and kissed and spent long hours wrapped in each other's arms, but they waited. It was 6 weeks before the circuit preacher finally came through the area. His name was Reverend Matthews, and he was a jovial man in his 60s with kind eyes and a booming laugh. He listened to their story with sympathy and agreed to marry them immediately. They were wed on a Sunday morning in late August, standing in the clearing by the spring with Reverend Matthews officiating and the trees as their witnesses. Amaryllis wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric Yates had traded for in a town 20 miles away. Simple but beautiful, the color of cream with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Yates wore clean trousers and a shirt he had clearly attempted to iron, his hair tied back neatly and his beard freshly trimmed. He looked so handsome that Amaryllis's breath caught when she saw him. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Matthews began, his voice carrying in the clear morning air, "we are gathered here today in the sight of God and nature to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Amaryllis barely heard the words of the ceremony. She was too focused on Yates, on the way he looked at her as though she were the most precious thing in the world, on the way his hands trembled slightly as he took hers, on the fierce love and devotion she saw shining in his blue eyes. "Do you, Yates Owens, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" "I do," Yates said, his voice strong and sure. "And do you, Amaryllis Harper, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" "I do," Amaryllis said, her voice ringing clear despite the tears streaming down her face. "Then, by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Matthews said with a broad smile. "You may kiss your bride." Yates pulled Amaryllis into his arms and kissed her deeply, pouring all his love and passion and devotion into that kiss. When they finally broke apart, both of them were grinning like fools. Reverend Matthews shared a simple lunch with them, blessed their union one more time, and then rode off with a promise to return in a few months to check on them. And then Yates and Amaryllis were alone, husband and wife at last. That night was everything Amaryllis had dreamed of and more. Yates was gentle and patient, taking his time to make sure she was comfortable and ready, showing her with his hands and his lips and his body just how deeply he loved her. There was some pain at first, but it faded quickly, replaced by sensations that were entirely new and wonderful. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed, Yates's strong arms wrapped protectively around her, and Amaryllis felt complete in a way she had never felt before. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Yates murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. More than words can say. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Amaryllis's life. She and Yates fell into an easy rhythm, working together during the day and holding each other at night. They laughed and talked and made love with a passion that never seemed to dim. Yates taught her to ride buck, to shoot a rifle, to track animals through the forest. Amaryllis taught Yates more refined cooking techniques, how to mend his clothes properly, how to read the poetry she loved. But as the weeks turned to months, Amaryllis began to notice something that troubled her. Despite her happiness, despite the love she shared with Yates, there was still a hollow place inside her, a longing for something she could not quite name. She missed the ritual of church, the sense of community and shared worship, even though she had no desire to return to Pastor Whitcomb's judgmental congregation. One evening in late October, as they sat by the fire after supper, she finally voiced her thoughts. "Yates," she said hesitantly, "can I ask you something?" "Anything," he said, looking up from the piece of wood he was carving. "You ever miss going to church?" she asked. "I know you said the mountains are your church, and I understand that, but do you ever miss the ritual of it? The hymns and the prayers and the sense of worship." Yates was quiet for a long moment, his hands stilling on the carving. "Sometimes," he admitted finally. "When my mother was alive, church was different. It was about love and grace and community. It was about helping each other and lifting each other up. That is what I miss. Not the building or the preaching, but that sense of shared faith and purpose." "I miss it too," Amaryllis confessed. "I know that sounds strange after everything that happened with Pastor Whitcomb. But I miss having a place to pray, a place that feels sacred and set apart, not his church, but something of our own." Yates looked at her thoughtfully. "What if we built one?" he asked. Amaryllis blinked. "What? What if we built our own chapel?" Yates said, warming to the idea. "Nothing fancy. Just a simple building where we could go to pray and worship in our own way. A place that would be about love and grace, not judgment. We could put it in the clearing by the spring where we were married. That land feels sacred to me already." Amaryllis felt something leap in her chest, a surge of excitement and hope. "Do you really think we could?" "I built this cabin," Yates said with a smile. "A chapel would be smaller and simpler. We could do it together, you and me. It would be ours, not belonging to any denomination or pastor. Just a place for us to worship God in our own way." "I would love that," Amaryllis breathed. "Oh, Yates, I would love that so much." They began planning that very night, sketching out ideas on scraps of paper by the firelight. The chapel would be small, just large enough for a dozen people to sit comfortably, though Yates and Amaryllis would likely be the only ones who ever used it. It would have a simple peaked roof to shed rain and snow, large windows to let in natural light, and a door that would always be open to anyone who needed sanctuary. And it would have a cross. Not a painted metal cross like the one in Pastor Whitcomb's church, but a hand-carved wooden cross that Yates would make himself, pouring all his skill and love into the creation. They began work the next day. Yates felled trees and shaped logs while Amaryllis helped him drag them to the clearing by the spring. It was back-breaking work, but they attacked it with enthusiasm, knowing that every log brought them closer to their goal. As they worked, they talked about what the chapel would mean to them, about the kind of faith they wanted to practice, about teaching their future children about love and grace rather than judgment and shame. It took them nearly 2 months to build the basic structure. Yates was a skilled carpenter, and under his direction the chapel slowly took shape. The walls went up first, sturdy and straight. Then the roof, carefully shingled to keep out the weather. Then the windows, which Amaryllis insisted on, even though glass was expensive and had to be ordered from San Antonio and hauled up to the mountains. "I want light," she explained when Yates questioned the expense. "I want this place to be full of light, not dark and gloomy." So they waited for the glass to arrive, and in the meantime, Yates began work on the cross. He chose a piece of oak from a tree that had been struck by lightning, the wood seasoned and strong. He worked on it every evening after supper, his large hands moving with surprising delicacy as he shaped and smoothed and carved. Amaryllis would sit beside him and watch, marveling at the way the cross emerged from the raw wood, as though it had been waiting there all along. Yates carved intricate patterns into the wood, vines and leaves and flowers that wound around the crossbeam, beautiful and organic. At the intersection of the beams he carved a heart, simple and perfect. "For you," he said when Amaryllis asked about it, "you brought love back into my life." It seems fitting that love should be at the center of our chapel. The words made Amaryllis cry, and she kissed him fiercely, overwhelmed by how lucky she was to have found this man. By mid-December, the chapel was finished. It stood in the clearing by the spring, small and simple and perfect. The wood had already begun to weather to a soft gray, and the windows gleamed in the winter sunlight. Inside, Yates had built simple wooden benches and a small altar at the front, and above the altar, mounted on the wall, was the cross he had carved, beautiful and sacred and full of love. They held their own private dedication ceremony on a cold, clear Sunday morning. Amaryllis had sewn cushions for the benches and picked late-blooming wildflowers to place on the altar. Yates had carved candlesticks to hold the candles they would light during services. Together, they stood in their little chapel and sang the hymns Amaryllis remembered from her childhood, their voices rising up to the rafters. "Lord, we dedicate this place to you," Yates prayed, his deep voice solemn. "Not as a monument to our righteousness, because we have none, but as a testament to your grace and love. May this be a place of sanctuary and peace for anyone who needs it. May it always be filled with love and acceptance, never with judgment or condemnation. We offer it to you with grateful hearts. Amen." "Amen," Amaryllis echoed, tears streaming down her face. They made it a practice to come to the chapel every Sunday morning for a short service of prayer and singing. Sometimes Amaryllis would read from the Bible her mother had given her years ago. Sometimes Yates would share thoughts about faith and God and the beauty of creation. Sometimes they simply sat in silence, holding hands and feeling the peace that filled the small building. But something unexpected began to happen. Word spread somehow about the little chapel in the mountains. Perhaps Reverend Matthews mentioned it when he passed through the area again. Perhaps some hunter or trapper stumbled upon it and told others. Whatever the reason, people began to show up. The first was a young couple from a ranch 20 miles away. They had been turned away from Pastor Whitcomb's church because they could not afford to pay the expected tithe, and they had heard about a chapel where all were welcome. Amaryllis and Yates invited them in, and the 4 of them held a simple service together, singing and praying and sharing the bread and cheese Amaryllis had prepared. Then came an older man whose wife had recently died, seeking comfort and a place to mourn. Then a family of farmers whose children had been told they were not properly baptized and therefore could not take communion. Then a former prostitute from a nearby town who had been treated with such cruelty by her local preacher that she had stopped attending church entirely. To all of them, Yates and Amaryllis opened the doors of their chapel. They offered no judgment, no condemnation, only love and acceptance. Yates would lead the services in his simple, straightforward way, focusing on grace and mercy rather than sin and damnation. Amaryllis would play the role of hostess, making sure everyone felt welcome, offering food and drink and a listening ear to anyone who needed it. The little chapel became known throughout the surrounding area as a place of refuge, a place where the broken and rejected could find acceptance. And at the center of it all was the beautiful wooden cross that Yates had carved with his own hands, a constant reminder that faith was about love, not judgment. Winter came to the mountains, bringing snow and cold winds, but the chapel remained warm and welcoming. Yates built a small wood stove to keep the space heated, and Amaryllis sewed thick curtains for the windows to help keep out drafts. They continued to hold services every Sunday, and people continued to come, sometimes a handful, sometimes a dozen or more. It was during one of these services, on a snowy Sunday in January, that Pastor Whitcomb showed up. Amaryllis saw him first, standing at the back of the chapel with a look of contempt on his thin face. She felt her stomach clench with anxiety, but Yates simply nodded at him and continued with the service. They were singing a hymn, voices raised in joyful chorus, and Whitcomb stood there looking increasingly angry. When the hymn ended, Whitcomb strode forward to the front of the chapel. "This is an outrage," he said, his voice cutting through the peaceful atmosphere like a knife. "You have no authority to hold services, Owens. You are not an ordained minister. This whole thing is a mockery of true faith." Yates stood calmly, his great height and broad shoulders making Whitcomb look small and petty by comparison. "I make no claim to be ordained," he said evenly. "We are simply believers gathering together to worship God. There is no law against that." "You are leading these people astray," Whitcomb insisted, "filling their heads with your false gospel of cheap grace and easy forgiveness. Faith requires discipline and sacrifice, not this weak sentimentality." "Faith requires love," Amaryllis said, standing up to face Whitcomb. Her voice was shaking but strong. "Faith requires compassion and mercy. All the discipline in the world means nothing without love. Even I know that, and I am just a simple seamstress." "You," Whitcomb said, turning his contempt on her, "are a disgrace. You ran off to live in sin with this man, and now you dare to pretend you have any moral authority." "We are married," Yates said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "Married by Reverend Matthews in a legal and binding ceremony, and you will not speak to my wife that way." "Matthews is as much of a fraud as you are," Whitcomb spat. "This entire charade is an insult to true believers everywhere. I am going to report you to the county authorities and have this place shut down." "On what grounds?" asked one of the farmers who had been attending services. "They are not breaking any laws. They are not taking money or making false claims. They are just offering a place to worship." "And a place where all are welcome," added the older man whose wife had died. "Which is more than I can say for your church, Whitcomb." Other voices joined in, people defending Yates and Amaryllis, speaking about how the chapel had helped them, how it had given them back their faith. Whitcomb's face grew redder and redder, until finally he turned and stalked out of the chapel, slamming the door behind him. There was a moment of silence, and then Amaryllis began to laugh. She could not help it. The absurdity of the situation, the sight of pompous Pastor Whitcomb being defended against by a group of people he had rejected, it was too much. Soon everyone was laughing, the tension broken, and the service continued in a spirit of joy and defiance. True to his word, Whitcomb did try to cause trouble. He filed complaints with the county officials, wrote letters to the bishop in San Antonio, did everything he could to have the chapel shut down, but he found no support. The county officials saw no legal reason to interfere with a private place of worship on private land. The bishop, when he finally responded months later, said that while the chapel was unorthodox, it did not appear to be teaching heresy or causing harm, and therefore he had no jurisdiction over it. Whitcomb's campaign against the chapel only served to make more people curious about it. Attendance grew steadily through the spring and into the summer. Yates and Amaryllis found themselves hosting services every Sunday for 20 or 30 people, and occasionally even more. It was more than they had ever imagined. But the greatest joy came in the late summer, when Amaryllis realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but she waited to be sure before telling Yates. When she finally did, on a warm August evening as they sat outside the cabin watching the sun set, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He let out a whoop of joy and picked her up, spinning her around before remembering himself and setting her down gently, his hands immediately going to her still flat stomach. "Are you sure?" he asked, his eyes shining with tears. "I am sure," Amaryllis said, laughing and crying at the same time. "We are going to have a baby, Yates." "A baby," he breathed, and then he was kissing her, deep and passionate and full of love. "I am going to be a father. We are going to be parents." They talked late into the night about the baby, about what they would name him or her, about the kind of parents they wanted to be. They agreed that they would raise their child with love and acceptance, teaching about faith and grace rather than fear and judgment. They would tell their child about the chapel they had built together, about how love and faith could overcome prejudice and cruelty. The pregnancy was not easy. Amaryllis suffered from terrible morning sickness in the first few months, and Yates hovered over her constantly, worried and protective. But as the months passed and her belly swelled with their growing child, she had never felt more beautiful or more loved. Yates would spend hours talking to the baby, his big hands gentle on her stomach, telling stories and singing songs in his deep, rumbling voice. Their daughter was born on a cold February morning in 1880, delivered with the help of a midwife from a nearby ranch and Yates's steady presence. It was a long, difficult labor, but when Amaryllis finally held their tiny daughter in her arms, every moment of pain was forgotten. They named her Grace, because grace was what had brought them together and grace was what they wanted their daughter to embody. She had Yates's blue eyes and Amaryllis's dark hair, and from the moment she entered the world, she was loved beyond measure. Yates was a wonderful father, gentle and patient and endlessly devoted. He carved toys for Grace, sang her lullabies in his rough voice, carried her everywhere in a sling he fashioned himself. He built a cradle for her beside their bed, smooth and beautiful, decorated with carved flowers and vines. And he looked at her with such wonder and love that Amaryllis often found herself tearing up just watching them together. Life settled into a new rhythm. Amaryllis would bring Grace to the chapel services, and the little girl became a favorite of the congregation. People would take turns holding her and cooing over her, and she would smile at everyone with the sunny disposition that seemed to be her nature. The chapel became even more of a family place, with other couples bringing their children, creating a community that was warm and accepting and full of life. When Grace was 2 years old, Amaryllis became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and she delivered a healthy son on a beautiful May morning. They named him Nathan, which meant gift from God, because that was exactly what he was. Nathan had his father's strong features and his mother's gentle nature, and from the beginning, he adored his big sister. Yates expanded the cabin to give the children more room, building an addition with a loft where they could sleep as they grew older. He carved them each a wooden horse and made them simple toys from scraps of wood. And he continued to carve, his skill growing with each piece, creating beautiful works of art that he would sometimes trade in town for supplies they needed. The chapel remained the center of their community. Over the years, it became known throughout the region as a place where anyone could find acceptance and grace. People came from miles around, bringing their joys and sorrows, their questions and doubts, their hopes and fears. And always, Yates and Amaryllis welcomed them with open arms, offering love and prayer and whatever help they could provide. Pastor Whitcomb died in the winter of 1885, bitter and alone, having driven away most of his congregation with his harsh judgments and cruel pronouncements. His church in Gonzales eventually closed, and many of his former parishioners made the journey to the little chapel in the mountains, seeking the love and acceptance they had been denied for so long. Amaryllis sometimes thought about those early days, about sitting in the back pew of Whitcomb's church feeling worthless and ashamed, about meeting Yates by the spring and having her whole life changed in an instant. She thought about how one act of kindness, one moment of compassion, had led to all of this. A loving marriage, beautiful children, a community of faith built on grace rather than judgment. By 1890, Grace was 10 years old and Nathan was 8. They were bright, happy children who loved the mountains and the chapel and the community that gathered there every Sunday. Grace had her father's gift for carving and would spend hours working on small projects, her tongue sticking out in concentration. Nathan had his mother's love of books and learning, and he would read anything he could get his hands on. Yates, now in his early 40s, had settled into middle age with Grace. His hair was shot through with gray, and his beard was more silver than brown, but he was still strong and vital. Still the protective, loving man Amaryllis had fallen in love with all those years ago. He still carried her over rough patches on the trail, still held her close every night, still looked at her with eyes full of love and wonder. And Amaryllis, at 34, felt more content and fulfilled than she had ever imagined possible. She had a husband who adored her, children who brought her joy, and a purpose that gave her life meaning. The chapel they had built together had become something far greater than they had ever dreamed, a beacon of hope and love for everyone who entered its doors. On their 12th wedding anniversary, Yates surprised her by taking her back to the spring where they had first met. The children stayed with neighbors for the day, giving Yates and Amaryllis rare time alone together. They sat on the same rock where she had been crying that day so long ago, and Yates pulled her close against his side. "You remember the first time we met?" he asked. "Every detail," Amaryllis said, smiling. "You were carrying an axe and looked like you could tear down trees with your bare hands. I was terrified at first." "And now?" Yates asked with a grin. "Now I know you would never hurt me," Amaryllis said. "Now I know that underneath all those muscles is the gentlest heart I have ever known." "You saved me that day, Yates. You saved me in every way a person can be saved." "You saved me too," Yates said seriously. "I was so lost before I met you, so angry and bitter and alone. You reminded me that life could be good, that there was still beauty and love in the world. You gave me a reason to be part of the world again, instead of hiding from it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the water trickle over the stones and watching the sunlight filter through the trees. Then, Yates reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. "I made you something," he said, holding out his hand. In his palm was a small wooden carving of the chapel, perfect in every detail down to the cross mounted above the altar. It was exquisite, a masterpiece of craftsmanship and love. "Yates," Amaryllis breathed, taking it carefully. "This is beautiful. I wanted you to have something to remember what we built together," Yates said. "Not just the building, but everything it represents. Love and faith and acceptance. A place where people can come and be themselves without fear of judgment. We did that, Amaryllis. You and me together." "We did," Amaryllis agreed, tears streaming down her face. "And I would not change a single moment of it." Yates kissed her then, deep and sweet and full of all the love they had shared over the years. And as the sun moved across the sky above them, they held each other close, grateful for every moment, every challenge, every joy they had experienced together. The years continued to pass in a rhythm of work and worship, of raising children and tending to their growing community. Grace grew into a beautiful young woman with her father's strength and her mother's compassion. She had a gift for music and would lead the hymns during services, her clear soprano voice ringing through the chapel. Nathan became a scholar, devouring every book he could find and showing a particular interest in medicine and healing. When Grace was 16, a young man from a nearby ranch began attending services at the chapel. His name was Daniel, and he was clearly smitten with Grace from the moment he saw her. Yates watched the courtship with a protective father's eyes, but even he had to admit that Daniel was a good young man, respectful and hardworking and genuinely kind. "He reminds me of you," Amaryllis told Yates one night as they lay in bed. "Not as big or as strong, but he has that same gentleness underneath, that same protective instinct." "I suppose he will do," Yates grumbled, but Amaryllis could hear the smile in his voice. Grace and Daniel were married in the chapel 2 years later, on a beautiful spring morning with the whole community in attendance. Reverend Matthews, now in his 80s but still sharp and active, performed the ceremony. Amaryllis cried through the entire service, watching her daughter pledge her life to the man she loved, remembering her own wedding day in this same clearing. After the ceremony, as the community celebrated with food and music, Yates pulled Amaryllis aside. They stood at the edge of the clearing, watching their daughter dance with her new husband, and Yates wrapped his arms around his wife from behind. "We did good," he said quietly. "Look at her. She is happy and confident and strong. She knows she is loved and worthy. That is what we gave her." "That is what you gave me first," Amaryllis said, leaning back against his broad chest. "You showed me that I was worthy of love and respect, even when the whole world seemed to be telling me otherwise. And because you loved me, I was able to give that same gift to our children." "I think we gave it to each other," Yates said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I was broken when we met, Amaryllis. You healed me. You made me whole again. And you gave me faith again," Amaryllis said. "Not the kind that Pastor Whitcomb preached, full of rules and judgment, but real faith, the kind that is built on love and grace and compassion, the kind that makes the world better instead of smaller." They stood there together, watching their family and friends celebrate, and Amaryllis thought about the journey that had brought them here. From that moment of despair by the spring to this moment of joy and fulfillment, it had been a long and sometimes difficult road. But every step had been worth it. Nathan left home at 19 to study medicine in San Antonio, but he returned every few months to visit and to help at the chapel. He would bring back medicines and books, sharing what he learned with the community. Eventually, he opened a small medical practice in a town 30 miles away, but he made sure to come home for every major holiday and family gathering. Grace and Daniel built a house on land adjacent to Yates and Amaryllis's property, and soon they were blessed with children of their own. 2 daughters and a son, all healthy and happy, all raised with the same values of love and acceptance that their grandparents had instilled in their mother. The chapel continued to grow and thrive. Over the years, Yates expanded it twice to accommodate the growing congregation. He carved new pews and built a small bell tower, installing a bell that rang out every Sunday morning, calling the faithful to worship. The sound of that bell ringing across the mountains became a symbol of hope and welcome for miles around. Amaryllis started a small school in addition to the chapel, teaching the children of the community to read and write. She used the skills she had learned through her own love of books, and she found that she had a gift for teaching. The children adored her, and under her guidance, many of them went on to pursue education and opportunities that would have been impossible otherwise. In the summer of 1905, Yates and Amaryllis celebrated their 27th wedding anniversary. They were in their 50s now, their hair gray and their faces lined with years, but their love for each other had only deepened with time. They had weathered storms together, both literal and figurative. They had lost friends to illness and old age, had seen hard times and good times, had raised children and now were helping to raise grandchildren. And through it all, the chapel stood as a testament to what they had built together. The wooden cross Yates had carved with his own hands still hung above the altar, its surface worn smooth by years, but its message unchanged. Faith was about love, not judgment. Grace was freely given to all who sought it, and no one who came seeking sanctuary would ever be turned away. On a beautiful Sunday morning in September of that year, Reverend Matthews made his final visit to the chapel. He was 92 years old now, frail but still alert, and he had come to see the community one last time before he retired for good. "I have married and buried more people than I can count," he told the assembled congregation that morning. "I have traveled thousands of miles and seen countless churches, but I have never seen anything quite like this place. What Yates and Amaryllis have built here is something truly special. A community based on love and acceptance, where everyone is welcome regardless of their past or their circumstances. This is what the church is supposed to be." There was not a dry eye in the building as Matthews finished his sermon. Afterward, he pulled Yates and Amaryllis aside for a private word. "I want you to know how proud I am of both of you," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "That day I married you by the spring, I knew you were special, but I never imagined you would create something this wonderful. You have brought real faith, real love to so many people. You have shown them the face of God in a way that Pastor Whitcomb never could." "We could not have done it without you," Amaryllis said, hugging the old man gently. "You gave us our start. You believed in us when no one else did." "And you took that belief and turned it into something miraculous," Matthews said. "Promise me you will keep this place going. Keep offering love and grace to everyone who needs it. The world needs more places like this." "We promise," Yates said, shaking the old man's hand. "For as long as we are able, this chapel will remain a sanctuary for anyone who seeks it." Reverend Matthews died peacefully in his sleep 3 months later. His funeral was held in the chapel, with Yates leading the service and what seemed like half the county in attendance. They buried him on a hillside overlooking the clearing, and Yates carved a beautiful headstone for his grave, engraved with the words, "He preached love and he lived it." As Yates and Amaryllis grew older, their children and grandchildren took on more responsibility for maintaining the chapel and the community. Grace and Daniel led many of the services now, with Grace's beautiful voice and Daniel's thoughtful sermons carrying on the tradition of love and acceptance. Nathan would return from his medical practice to offer health clinics for the community, treating ailments and injuries free of charge for anyone who needed help. But Yates and Amaryllis remained the heart of the chapel. They were there every Sunday morning, sitting in the front pew, holding hands and singing hymns with voices that might have grown weaker but were no less joyful. People would seek them out for advice and counsel, knowing that they would receive wisdom born of experience and compassion. On a crisp autumn morning in 1910, Yates and Amaryllis stood in the clearing by the spring where they had first met 32 years earlier. They came here often now, on anniversary days and special occasions, to remember their beginning and to give thanks for all they had been given. "Do you ever regret it?" Yates asked, pulling Amaryllis close against his side. "Leaving town, giving up the life you might have had?" Amaryllis looked up at her husband, at the face she loved more than any other, and smiled. "Not for a single moment," she said. "You gave me everything that matters. Love, family, purpose, faith. What more could I possibly want?" "I feel the same way," Yates said. "You took a broken, bitter man and showed him how to live again. You gave me a reason to come down from the mountain and be part of the world. Everything good in my life started the day I met you." They stood there together, two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. The chapel bell began to ring, calling them to service, and hand in hand, they walked back to the building they had created together. The little chapel still stood strong, weathered by years of sun and wind and rain, but solid and welcoming. The wooden cross still hung above the altar, its carved heart still beating with the message of love and grace. And as Yates and Amaryllis entered through the doors, they were greeted by the smiling faces of their family and their community, all the people whose lives had been touched by the sanctuary they had built. That morning's service was particularly joyful. They sang the old hymns with gusto, their voices rising to the rafters. Grace led a prayer of thanksgiving for family and community. Nathan shared news of medical advances that could help those suffering from illness. Daniel read from Scripture, focusing on passages about love and mercy. And when it was over, when the last hymn had been sung and the last prayer had been offered, the community gathered outside for a potluck lunch, sharing food and fellowship under the warm autumn sun. Children ran and played while adults talked and laughed. Grandparents held babies while young couples stole moments alone. Yates and Amaryllis sat together on a bench outside the chapel, watching it all with deep satisfaction. They had built something that would outlast them, something that would continue to bring light and love to the world long after they were gone. The cross Yates had carved would remain, a symbol of faith built on compassion rather than judgment. The chapel would stand, a sanctuary for all who needed it. "I love you," Amaryllis said softly, leaning her head on Yates's broad shoulder. "I love you too," Yates replied, pressing a kiss to her silver hair. "Today, tomorrow, and forever." And as the sun moved across the sky and the sound of laughter filled the air, they sat together in perfect contentment, knowing that their love story, which had begun with tears by a spring and a mountain man's kindness, had created ripples that would continue to spread outward, touching lives and bringing hope for generations to come. The pastor, who had refused to let a grieving woman take communion, had unwittingly set in motion a chain of events that brought far more people to faith than he ever had with his harsh judgments. And the mountain man, who had built a chapel with a cross he carved himself, had proven that real faith was not found in grand buildings or stern sermons, but in simple acts of love and grace offered freely to all who sought them. Their story was complete, their legacy secure, and their love eternal.